y'all, Melissa here with you today, and I am wearing today's project. I'm not only going to show you how I made this particular bucket hat, but I'm going to show you how to use a free template on my site to draft basically any kind of hat you can dream up. So I'll be showing you the process with a bucket hat, but you can use this same process for pretty much any shape of hat that you want. So check out the link in the video description to get the hat template, and then I will meet you back at the camera to show you how I used it to make this hat. Before we get started on how to use that pattern template that I hope you grabbed at the link below, we need to talk real quick about the parts of a hat. So the top part of a hat on your head is called the crown of the hat, and then this is called the band. That's the part that connects the crown to the brim. The part that sticks out at the bottom is the hat brim. So keep those three things in mind as I show you how we draft those three pieces of the pattern. Let's look at how to measure so that we can see how to use the hat template. So first you want to measure the circumference of your head. And you want to go around like where your hat would hit and measure that in a circle. To figure out the other parts of your hat, I actually like to take something like a string or a piece of elastic, put it around your head like where you measured for the crown so that we can measure some other things. So I want to make a bucket style hat here, and I want to measure from the elastic on my head up to see how high I want the side band. If I was going to make a top hat, for example, I might want to measure, how high do I want my top hat to be? So whatever you're doing for the band, you want to go ahead and measure that and figure out like how tall do you want it. And then you also need to figure out, do you want your hat to kind of slope in a little bit or a lot, or do you want straight up and down? So if you were using a top hat, you would want the circumference measurement and the crown to be the exact same. For a bucket hat, like I'm going to make, I want to measure kind of across the top of my head here and see, do I want it a little bit smaller? And I actually do. I don't want it like super pointy, but I don't want it straight up and down. I want just a little bit of slant there. So that's gonna all help me figure out how to use the hat template to make my pattern. The other thing you need to figure out is how far out do you want your brim to stick? So again, for a top hat, I might want like just a little bit of a brim. For a bucket hat, like I'm going to make, I might want a little bit of a brim, and I might want it down at a little bit of an angle. For a sun hat, I might want a much wider brim, and I might want it to stick straight out so that it will cast the maximum amount of shade on me. So all of those considerations, figure them out, write down the measurements, and then let's take a look at how to use this hat template. So with this hat template, the first thing you need to figure out is for the crown of the hat, what do you want to do? And my head circumference was 21.5 inches, and you can see I've got this line being marked here. And then I want my hat to slant in just a little bit. So I actually want to choose a crown size that is slightly smaller than the circumference of my head. So if my head is 21.5, I'm actually going to go all the way in and choose the smallest crown size on this template, which is 19.5. So it will slant in just about 2 inches in total circumference. And then I need to do a seam allowance on that. So what I did, here is my pattern. I chose the smallest size, and then I measured out 1/2 inch, and I cut on that line because that gives me a seam allowance of 1/2 inch. And once that's taken in, then I can sew, and the crown will end up being that smallest size there. If you were doing a top hat, for example, and let's say your head actually measured 19.5 inches, you would want to measure out from that 1/2 inch, which would get you out here to this line, and I would actually cut on the 21.5 inch template pattern. Now each of these measurements refer to the total circumference of that line, and of course they only work if you've printed this to scale. So if your test square here is not measuring 2 inches by 2 inches, these are not going to measure what they say they measure. Once you've figured out that crown template, then you can draft the side and the brim. So the side band, the part where it is sewn to the crown here at the top, that needs to be the same length as whatever your crown pattern is. So since I'm using the 19.5 crown pattern, I need this to be 19.5 inches. But if I sew the side band straight up and down like this, it is not going to fit on this part of my head because the circumference of my head was 21.5. So I have to add some width down here. And as you can see, I've drawn some lines on the pattern. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut through those lines. And notice I'm cutting almost to the top, but not through the whole thing. Okay, I need to add 2 inches so that my bottom of my side band will match the circumference of my head. And so I've cut 8 slits here, and what I need to do is I need to spread each one 1/4 of an inch to get that final 2 inches added into my hat band. And I'm just doing this approximately right here, but you can see how this is going to very slightly curve my band so that the bottom seam will be longer and the top one will be shorter, and that's what's going to give that slant to my hat. Now I'm going to take this onto another piece of paper, I'm going to tape these, and I'm going to measure precisely so that I make sure this band is exactly the length that I need it to be. Here is my side band, and this is going to have the correct measurement on the bottom and the top, and then you can see I added seam allowances all the way around. You can also see that when I was spreading apart my pattern, I was making sure to match it on the actual seam line, not out here on the seam allowances. That's important when you're working with curves. You want the seam lines to match up, not necessarily the raw edges. And then of course I've also added seam lines on the ends here so that I can sew this into a loop. And this is 3 inches tall, being between the seam lines, which is the amount I measured on the side of my head, and that gives me an extra 1/2 inch to attach the brim and a 1/2 inch at the top to attach the crown. To draft the brim, I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm starting with 21.5 inches, and then that is going to match to the side band. And I need to cut it on all these lines, I need to spread it apart, and that is going to give me the side brim. Now, the more you spread it, the more it looks like a circle when you're done, the more the brim will stick out flat. The less you spread it, the more it will angle in towards your head. So if I wanted like a sunshade type of hat, I would actually spread it quite a bit until these pieces like met in a circle. I would make sure every piece of that was even. I might even take my crown template and match it to that. Or an easier way, if you want a flat brim, just go ahead and use a compass, measure out from your crown and like trace around in a big flat circle so you don't have to do this slashing and spreading. For a bucket hat, like what I want to make, I don't actually want a whole circle, but I do want to spread quite a bit. And my brim is 2 inches between the seam lines. Note that if you don't curve it at all, like your brim's just going to come straight down next to your face. You do have to curve it some so that it can come further away from your face. Okay, y'all, here is my brim pattern piece, and I want to point out a couple advantages of hats when you are paper patterning them. First of all, when you are doing a paper pattern, you can literally like cut the seam allowances off, and then you can try it on your head to see, is that going to be the correct width? Is that going to be the angle you want, etc. When you're doing the brims and you're spreading your pattern out a lot like this, I also recommend that after you kind of get it spread out, which I ended up doing 3/4 of an inch on each of these because on first try it was too close to my face still. When you're spreading these out, it's easy to get kind of misaligned this way. So then make sure to fold it in half and cut it out with 1/2 of it so that your two sides are symmetrical. So you can see I did that. And when I did, some of the originally drafted seam allowance got cut off of this side and some extra paper got added down to the bottom here. But now my brim piece is symmetrical and it's going to work for my hat. Let's talk about the materials to make a hat. So I'm going to be using cotton twill for the outer part of my hat. Generally, heavier weight materials are going to work better. Things like twill, denim, canvas. If you want to use something like a quilting cotton, it's going to need some interfacing and maybe even more than one layer so that the hat will have some body. For the inside, I prefer to use cotton, and I'm just using this cotton print here. I like to have some fun with the linings because usually you're the only one that sees those, so they're like a secret surprise for you. And then I also use heavier weight fusible interfacing. I'm going to use this all over the whole hat just to give this twill a little more body because it's a little lightweight and thin and has a little more drape than I would prefer for a hat. You can fuse multiple layers of interfacing on if you're using a thinner fabric until you get kind of the body that you want for your hat. And then finally, for the brim, I'm using this material and I'm going to use probably 2 layers of it. This is called buckram, and I have links below to the materials that I use. But this is kind of like a sew-in interfacing that's just stiffer than heavyweight interfacing. Another option, if you can't find buckram, I have sometimes used a pretty heavy product made by Pellon, the same people that make the interfacing, called Peltex, and that is another like thicker, more body thing that you can put in the brim to stiffen it up. Here are my pieces for my hat cut out. First, I've cut 2 buckram pieces for the brim, and then I've cut the brim twice out of the outer fabric because you will see the top and the bottom side of the brim, so use the main fabric to cut those. I have cut the crown and the side band out of the outer fabric, and then I've also cut those out of heavyweight interfacing, and I've gone ahead and fused that to the wrong side. And then I've cut the side band and the crown out of lining. Let's start assembling the hat. I'm going to be showing you how to do this on the lining because I think it's easier to see because of the colors I'm using today. So the first thing I want to do is I want to mark 1/4 points on the wrong side of the fabric. And before I mark anything more than the halfway point, I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And now I can match that seam with my center front mark and mark the side 1/4 points. Okay, you can see those markings all the way around my brim here. I want to repeat the process with the crown and the side band. My next step is going to be pinning the side band to the crown, and I will be matching those 1/4 points that I just marked. Once I have those 1/4 points pinned in, I'm going to try to distribute the fabric evenly in between them, and I'm kind of stretching them apart and pinning somewhere in the middle. And this is going to be the most difficult seam to sew on this hat because you have more of a curve on the crown than you do on the side band. And so there's going to be excess fabric at the raw edge of the crown piece, but they should match up at the seam lines. Once I have that done, I'm going to take this to the machine and stitch it. I highly recommend that for the first pass on this, that you baste and use a basting stitch so that if you have any lumps, bumps, or anything you need to fix, you can easily unpick that stitching, fix your lumps and bumps, and then stitch it all the way around with a smaller stitch length for a more secure seam. Okay, check that stitching line for lumps and bumps and use the seam ripper to fix any areas where the fabric might have gotten puckered and it's not a smooth seam line. And once you have that done, go ahead and go back over your stitching with a smaller stitch. Once that's done, then in order to get this seam to lay nicer, we're going to go ahead and clip into all these curves, and I'm just going around and I'm going to snip like up to that stitching line all the way around. Next, what I need to do, I am going to match the brim onto this. So right sides together, I want to match the seam line of the side band and the seam line of the brim. And then just like I did for the crown, I'm going to go through and I am going to match those quarter points that are marked. Make sure that it is the shorter curved edge of the brim that is getting matched to the side band here. And then let's take this to the machine and stitch around. And I'm going to stop stitching about 2.5 to 3 inches from where I started. And that gap is where I will turn the hat right side out. So you can see I didn't stitch this part here. So here is the other half of my hat that I've gone ahead and stitched. And this half, as you can see, is much stiffer. First of all, I have the buckram that is in the brim, and you can see that I cut the majority of it. I trimmed it out of the seam allowance after I stitched these pieces. I kind of basted the buckram on and then trimmed it. And then up here we've got the interfaced portion of the hat. The final step here is going to be to attach the lining and the hat to finish it off. So I want to go ahead and match the seams on my brim here. And then we're going to be matching the brim all around that raw outer edge. Then let's take this over to the machine and stitch around that brim. And then what I need to do is find that gap again in my lining. Here we are. And I can turn my hat right side out. And then you push the lining up into the hat, and you want to go around the edges of the brim, and definitely you want to finger press this. You probably don't want to iron this unless you maybe just iron on the very edge and you don't use any steam, because that'll make the buckram less stiff and then your brim will get floppy. So I prefer to just kind of finger press all around the edge of the brim. Okay, 2 steps left. 1, I like to top stitch on the brim. And I like to set my stitching over by moving my needle and making sure the entire part of the hat is under the presser foot and over the feed dogs. And you can, of course, go and add more lines of stitching around the brim if you prefer more than one. That is definitely a look that is on some types of hats. But for this, we're just going to top stitch the one. And then the other thing I need to do is I need to pin these seam allowances in here where I left the gap. And I need to use a ladder stitch to close that up so that I don't have a hole in my hat. I want to note, you can also leave the hole for turning in the seam between the crown and the side band, and then have that be where you are attaching the 2 pieces with your ladder stitch so that you can't see the hole where you turned anymore. But this is our completed hat once that line of stitching is done. And check out this playlist for more accessory and clothing type projects.